Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight marks the opening of our 2012-13 Signature Lecture Series, and on behalf of everyone at CIGI, I'm very happy that you're joining us for what will be a very timely discussion and I hope a very enjoyable season of lectures. Besides the audience here today, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. So following this evening's address, we welcome questions from the audience. Here in the CIGI auditorium, you have question cards and pencils that we ask you to fill out those cards and pass to the end of the aisle. And we'll accept these at 8 o'clock. If you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to our panel. I would like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your continuing support. I'd also like to thank the Balsley School of International Affairs for co-sponsoring this event, and I'd like to thank The Economist for providing free copies of their most recent magazine edition to our audience here tonight. If you haven't picked up a copy, there may still be some left following tonight's lecture outside the auditorium. I'd also like to acknowledge a special guest, our Member of Parliament for Kitchener-Waterloo, Peter Braid. Thank you for coming. Our topic tonight is Obama, Romney, and Iran. In light of the recent Democratic and Republican national conventions as the electoral race heats up in the US, and in consideration of Canada's decision to suspend diplomatic activities with Iran, I couldn't think of a better topic to start our new season with. Tonight's guest of honor is global security expert Bruce Riedel, who will be introduced at greater length and more appropriately in a moment. Also playing a lead role in tonight's lecture are Janet Lang, a research professor at the Balsley School, and James Blight, the CIGI Chair in Foreign Policy Development at the Balsley School. Jim and Janet are both award-winning authors, scholars, and experts in critical oral history, recognized as the world's leading specialists on American foreign policy during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were heavily involved in the making of two recent award-winning films, The Fog of War, 11 Lessons from the Life of Robert S. McNamara, and Virtual JFK, Vietnam If Kennedy Had Lived. They're the authors of several publications. They've led groundbreaking projects on preventing nuclear war, and they're continuing their research on the Cuban Missile Crisis through a new project called the Armageddon Letters, which you can learn more about by visiting www.armageddonletters.com. One of their most recent publications, in which they collaborated with Mr. Riedel, is entitled Becoming Enemies, U.S.-Iran Relations and the Iran-Iraq War, 1978 to 1988. You can purchase this book tonight, as copies are for sale just outside the auditorium and at a 20% discount. I ask that you please help me to welcome Professor James Blight to the stage, who will now introduce this evening's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Fred. Good evening, and welcome to our live audience in the CIGI Campus Auditorium here in Uptown Waterloo, our home of the past 2.5 years, in which we are very, very happy. I'm Jim Blight. I'm a faculty member of the Balsley School of International Affairs and the History Department at the University of Waterloo. I will introduce this CIGI Signature Lecture. Our distinguished guest, Bruce Riedel, to my immediate right, will deliver the lecture, and Janet Lang, my colleague at BSIA and in the UW History Department, research partner and wife of 36 years of uninterrupted bliss, will begin collecting written questions. I had the same exact reaction. I don't know. I mean, if you can't have fun with international crises, I mean, why do it at all? Anyway, we'll begin collecting your questions, as Fred said, around 8 o'clock. On paper, for those of you in the auditorium, and digitally for those of you in the webcast audience. Janet will assemble and organize them and present them to Bruce for his consideration. Last Friday, right on cue from us, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper ordered Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs John Baird to close Canada's embassy in Tehran and evacuate at once all members of the Canadian diplomatic mission in Iran. At the same time, Canada expelled all Iranian diplomats from the country, giving them 5 days to depart. Thus has Canada now joined the US and the UK in severing its remaining ties with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the US doing it more than 30 years ago, the Brits doing it last year. Minister Baird listed among the reasons for the move Iran's recent pursuit of nuclear weapons capability, its hostility toward Israel, its human rights abuses, and its support of international terrorism. These were the reasons for leaving. There are others who believe that these should be the reasons for staying. For the immediate future, therefore, Canada joins a growing number of Western countries whose only engagement with Iran is the application of increasingly harsh sanctions with the possibility of military action against suspected Iranian nuclear facilities. As the issue has been debated in the Canadian media, the moves have been seen as perhaps necessary to protect Canadian diplomats from harm. We all remember what happened in 1979 at the US Embassy. But at the same time, others emphasize that the move marks the loss of one of the only remaining channels through which Iran and the West might meaningfully communicate with one another by some means other than threat and counter-threat. An old adage of diplomats is that when the embassies are closed, war must be on the horizon. Is the West, spurred on by the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, preparing for war with Iran? Many believe the answer is yes. The trigger to such an attack, should it occur, will be the failure of economic sanctions and covert measures to retard Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Again, supposing for the moment that, as almost everyone believes, Tehran is actually pursuing a nuclear weapon capability. This issue, the standoff with Iran, has now become one of the sharpest points of contention between US President Barack Obama and the Republican nominee Mitt Romney. Romney has relentlessly criticized Obama for what he claims is a weak, wishy-washy, and half-hearted attempt to squeeze Iran into negotiating away its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Romney has said that if elected, he will immediately order what he calls crippling and even disabling sanctions, and that if Iran does not cry uncle by some deadline the new President Romney will impose, he will, and I quote again, take a very close look at the military option, unquote. In close consultation at all times with the Netanyahu government, which has been seen as critical of Obama's approach to Iran. In fact, it is difficult to avoid the impression now that Netanyahu has become an ex officio member of the campaign to elect Mitt Romney. It is widely reported that Obama finds Netanyahu a reckless, pedantic bully, as an Obama aide said recently, a royal pain in the butt. That's a quote. So it appears that the question of war or no war soon, or no war without exploration of other options, in short, that the critical question of war or peace in the Middle East may, to a considerable extent, be decided by the November 6th U.S. presidential election. We are privileged to have with us tonight for this CIGI Signature Lecture a speaker uniquely able to assess the intersection between U.S. electoral politics and U.S. foreign policy, who brings to the topic a specialist savvy on the Islamic Republic of Iran's tortured history with the West, the state of the Iran nuclear program, and the Israeli piece of a vast puzzle of what will happen in this standoff with Iran. I am not making this up. Bruce Riedel really is centrally involved in every one of these issues, as only an insider can be. After graduating from Brown University, Bruce Riedel went on to earn a degree in diplomatic history from Harvard University. He entered the government service in 1978, a very auspicious year to sign up for duty as a budding Middle East analyst at the CIA. His job, to figure out what the Iranian Revolution was all about and why the Iranians had taken Americans hostage at the US Embassy in Tehran. He was thereafter involved in every Middle East development of significance in US foreign policy until his retirement from the US government in 2006. During that period, he advised Presidents George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush from posts in the White House, the Defense Department, and the CIA. He is now a senior fellow, an author, at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at one of the sister institutions of CIGI, the Brookings Institution in Washington. Bruce Riedel became a senior advisor on the Middle East to then Senator Barack Obama during the 2008 campaign. After the election, he was asked by the president to co-chair the group charged with developing a new strategy for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Since then, Bruce Riedel has published prolifically and spoken with his trademark candor, which you're about to experience, all over the world about a wide range of Middle East security issues. He has also, by the way, been the engine of a project that Janet and I are involved with on the vexed history of Iran's relationship with the West, also mentioned by Fred. His only weakness, if it is a weakness, is, and I must tell you this with a heavy heart, he is, believe it or not, a dyed-in-the-wool fan of the Montreal Alouettes. Here in Argo and Tycat land, that's almost unforgivable. But nobody's perfect, not even Bruce. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Bruce Riedel.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Jim. I only wish now I'd brought my Al's hat to wear tonight, but you'll see it tomorrow morning. Thank you also, Fred, for hosting this. It's a delight to be back in Waterloo and a delight to be back at CIGI. This is my second trip since Jim and Janet moved here, and I have enjoyed tremendously the opportunity to come here today. I also want to thank the Government of Canada for making this issue more relevant for you and thus boosting turnout for us. I don't know how you accomplished that, but very, very clever. I want to especially thank both Jim and Janet for their partnership in the Becoming Enemies project. Becoming Enemies is a book, but it's much, much more than a book. It's a project that spans several years and several conferences, although one conference in particular produced the outcome of the book. It is a remarkable example of what Jim and Janet do best, which is oral history, getting participants to look back and recall events and then pontificate and ruminate on those events and put together a renewed interest in them. It's really unfortunate that oral history has only become a modern mechanism in the last few decades. It would be great if we had oral history for events like the American Civil War or the Roman Republic. Unfortunately, we only have it for the last few decades, and Jim and Janet are the sterling leaders in the world in putting together oral history projects. Let me start with a little truth in advertising. You've already heard it, but I think you should hear it from me directly. I'm talking about Obama, Romney, and Iran. I was an early supporter of the junior senator from Illinois in 2007, actually in March of 2007. In March of 2007, the Obama foreign policy team could have sat very comfortably in the chairs on the stage. We were a pretty small group of people. That's no longer the case, I'm happy to say. So I don't come here as a disinterested or dispassionate observer. But there are no votes to be had in this room, thankfully. So I think I can be as candid as I want to be. And I'm not here to persuade you what you should do if you were to vote in the American elections on November 6th. This election campaign, like most election campaigns in the United States, is not really about foreign policy. Bill Clinton famously said it's the economy stupid, and it is the economy stupid this time again. Most foreign policy issues really are getting very, very little attention in the campaign. Most famously, the longest war in American history, the war in Afghanistan, is basically not being debated in this campaign at all. The challenger, Governor Romney, completely failed to mention it in his acceptance speech. And while the president was quick to jump on that failure, he didn't really talk about it either in his speech at the Democratic convention. Other issues like the future of China, the future of Russia, other foreign policy issues really are getting almost no attention. Now that may have changed in the last 24 hours, we'll see, but at least up until the events in Benghazi, foreign policy was really not on the agenda for this campaign, with one exception, and the exception is Iran, and the question of Iran's aspirations or alleged aspirations to develop nuclear weapons. Iran has been a hot button issue in the United States since 1978 and since 1979. The events of 1979, the holding of 44 Americans hostage for that long a period of time, had a scarring impact on America. Right or wrong, it has made Iran the bad guy, the boogeyman of American politics for the last 3+ decades. Interestingly, though, when you look at it, the difference between the two candidates is a little bit hard to discern to the objective eye. Both President Obama and Governor Romney are very, very tough on the issue of Iran. Both say Iran cannot be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. There's a little bit of nuance about whether it can develop the capability, but both are pretty hard and clear. It cannot be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. Both have said all options are on the table, which is code word, of course, for going to war. And both have gone far beyond saying all options are on the table. Both have said they would seriously contemplate the use of force to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Both advocate harsh sanctions against Iran. Both advocate covert action against Iran. Both have also said that the containment of Iran, should it get nuclear weapons, is not on the table. It's off the table. That option is off the table. President Obama has said that explicitly. I don't know that Governor Romney has ever said it explicitly as well, but I'm sure if he was asked, do you agree with President Obama it should be off the table, he'd say yes. So that one's, all options are on the table except the option of containment and deterring Iran should it acquire nuclear weapons. Despite this consensus between the two candidates, Governor Romney, as Jim laid out, has made this a central plank in his campaign. He has said the president has been too weak, too eager to negotiate, and naive in dealing with the Iranians. He says we should have done more to help the green movement in Iran when it appeared that the Iranian regime was in some serious trouble. He has said this is Obama's, quote, greatest failure as a president in letting Iran continue to develop a nuclear capability. He has said that the president, in doing so, has risked an American ally, Israel, and that he has, quote, thrown Israel under the bus. As Jim also highlighted, this is a reminder that the US-Iran relationship has a third party. I'm always tempted to remind people of what the late Princess of Wales said about her marriage. There was always a third party in the bedroom. In this case, the third party in the bedroom between the United States and Iran is Israel. And Israel is, of course, also a hot button topic in American politics. No American politician wants to look soft on Israel. What then is President Obama's real track record over the last 4 years? How weak, how naive has he been, in fact? Well, it is true that the president tried diplomacy when he came into office, famously. And he continues to offer a diplomatic way out of the crisis with Iran. To me, that makes good sense. We should always have a diplomatic option available. The very fact that he tried diplomacy has made it much more possible to seriously contemplate other options. We would have never have gotten the international consensus we have about Iran today had the president not tried diplomacy. It's also true that the president probably was slow to react to the Green movement in Iran. But to be fair, no one else seems to have anticipated it was coming. No one else seems to have had a very good solution to what to do about it. And the American embrace of the Green movement would probably have done more to damage it than anything else we could have done. The fact of the matter is that we are in the midst of profound revolutionary change throughout the Middle East. The era of police states and dictatorships is changing. I'm not saying it's over. God knows we wish it was. But it's changing in profound ways. And Iran, in some ways, led the path that led to the Arab Spring and the Arab Awakening. And we're all having a great deal of difficulty figuring out how to cope with that change. And it's certainly true that President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu are not buddies. I'm not going to repeat the quotes that Jim gave you. You heard them once, you don't need to hear them again. It's pretty clear that the President and the Prime Minister not only have profound differences on a wide range of issues, I think most notably the Palestinian question, but that the personal chemistry between them is terrible. All you have to do is look at the pictures of the two of them sitting next to each other and listening to each other to recognize these two people really, really don't like each other. I think it is fair to say that Prime Minister Netanyahu's #1 goal this year is regime change on the Potomac. But he doesn't get to vote either. I would also point you, though, to two other aspects of President Obama's policy towards Iran over the last 4 years, which I think it is pretty hard to say have not demonstrated toughness and a pretty steely-eyed determination. First is his diplomacy at the United Nations. Yes, it's diplomacy, but look at the outcome. So far, the United Nations Security Council has passed 6 resolutions dealing with the Iranian nuclear question. All 6 of those resolutions had unanimous support of the permanent 5 members of the Council. All of them were adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which means that they are directly related to the use of force. Each is in turn a progressive tightening of the pressure on Iran and demand that Iran cease its activity in the area of developing nuclear weapons capability. The most important, though, was clearly passed on President Obama's watch. It's UN Security Council Resolution 1929, passed in June of 2010. Resolution 1929 is really quite an impressive document. It bans the sale to Iran of all military equipment across the board, from pistols to jet airplanes, to intercontinental ballistic missiles, to tanks, to naval vessels, you name it. All military sales, all military exports to Iran are banned under this resolution in perpetuity. That is, until it is changed by the consent of the UN Security Council. Very few countries in the history of the United Nations have ever seen a sanctions resolution as wide-sweeping as the one Iran was put under 1929. When countries have had sanctions resolutions in the past, it has usually been for some open and obvious egregious violation of a national border. Iran has not done that. UN Security Council Resolution 1929 also had unanimous P5 support, meaning that the 5 largest arms exporting countries in the world have all agreed they will not export arms to Iran. What does that mean in practice? It means Iran's military capability is more or less frozen in time. Iran can't build tanks. Iran can't build jet fighter aircraft. Iran today finds itself with an air force which is an antique show and becoming more and more of an antique show every day. They have F-4s and F-5s bought by the Shah back in the 1960s and 70s with no prospect that they're going to get more advanced military equipment. Iran can build certain things on its own, but the Iranian economy is not a modern industrial economy that can produce advanced weapon systems. The only military ally Iran has in the world today is Syria. Not exactly a stronghold of military force to begin with, and certainly not one today after 18 months of civil war. Contrast that to Israel, which has the support of the United States of America, which receives over $3 billion in military grant aid every year for the last 30 years, over $100 billion in assistance. There is no political conversation in the United States about that. No congressman, no president has ever challenged the decision to give Israel that much money. Governor Perry, you may remember in the debates, briefly hinted that aid to Israel will be reviewed on an annual basis. Within minutes, he was pulverized on the internet and the blogosphere by Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike. It's one of the reasons he's not the nominee of the Republican Party. Defense Minister Ehud Barak of Israel has said more than once that the US-Israeli security relationship in the last 4 years is stronger than it has ever been before, more innovative, more intellectually and energy stimulating than ever before. Of course, in addition to Resolution 929, we also have increasing economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are now taking a greater and greater bite on Iran. The Department of Treasury today announced that its estimate is that Iranian oil exports have dropped 55% this year. Since oil exports are the lifeline of the Iranian economy, that's a pretty significant bite. So there's one policy Obama has pursued, which I think it's pretty hard to say isn't pretty tough. Secondly, of course, President Obama has initiated a cyber war against Iran. It's never been publicly announced, but like a lot of top secret projects, it's not a secret to anybody who reads the New York Times. The New York Times' David Sanger has written a book, Confront and Conceal, in which he lays out the cyber war against Iran in great detail. He even gives you the code name, Operation Olympic Games. I don't know whether that's the real code name, but no one in the government has denied that that's the code name. No one has seriously denied Mr. Sanger's account that this is a major American policy using cyber warfare against the Iranian program. Now, truth in advertising again, what I know about cyber warfare is zero. I find it hard to use my BlackBerry, let alone using the concept of trying to attack someone else's BlackBerry. If it was left to me, I would pick it up with a sledgehammer and break it. So don't ask me to explain cyber warfare, other than to, I think, get what you all know. It is a very effective way of attacking the other side's computers and electronic information management systems, and anything that relies upon computers to work. Officials of the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, the Mossad, and officials of the Israeli Department of Military Intelligence and the Israeli Defense Forces have both said very carefully, but clearly in public, that this cyber warfare has had tremendous effect upon the Iranian program, probably delaying it by more than a year over the course of the last 4 years. Now, cyber warfare is a dangerous new development. This is something that no one has really done before. Israel's done some to the Iranians, but by all accounts, the American program is much more advanced, and it works with the Israelis. Cyber warfare is a big, big step. And I think it's hard to make the case that it shows President Obama is soft on Iran. But let's turn away from the question, is Obama really the naive, soft guy that Mitt Romney wants Americans to believe he is? Let's turn to what I think is the more important question. What if sabotage and diplomacy fail? What if, despite Olympic Games, 1929, economic sanctions, global diplomatic pressure, a lot of heavy breathing out of Jerusalem and Washington, Iran is not dissuaded and chooses to develop a nuclear weapon? What would a military operation against Iran look like in the real world? What are we talking about when we say all options should remain on the table? When we hint that we are prepared to use military force? When it is background to the American media that the United States military has a plan for a comprehensive military operation against Iran to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons? In other words, what happens if Iran doesn't back down and we stay on the course we're on? This is where I think the project that Jim, Janet, and I comes so usefully into play. Becoming Enemies. Becoming Enemies provides a huge contribution to this debate, because Becoming Enemies takes us back to the 1980s. At the late end of the 1980s, during the final year and a half of the Iran-Iraq War, the United States joined the war. Never publicly, it never issued a declaration of war, but we became a co-belligerent with Iraq. Now, most Americans don't remember that. After all, being Saddam's co-belligerent was not something very popular after August 1990. And since the Reagan administration ended up being in the position where they were supporting both sides in the Iran-Iraq war, catastrophically in the Iran-Contra episode, Ronald Reagan's backers and enthusiasts don't usually highlight this when they talk about his transformative role as an American president. But it's a fact. We fought an undeclared naval and air war with Iran in the late 1980s. And that's why Becoming Enemies becomes so important, because I think you can draw lessons from that war for the future. History never repeats itself. We all know that. But as some say, history rhymes. And there are lessons to be learned by looking back. And you make a big mistake if you don't bother to look back at those lessons. And through the unique mechanism of oral history, I think Becoming Enemies has provided us a way of looking at those lessons if you take a look at this project. Just to remind you, the Iran-Iraq War was the largest and longest conventional military conflict in world history since the end of the Korean War in 1953. It was a conventional conflict that looked in many ways like the First World War, trench warfare on a massive scale. It was unbelievably bloody. No one knows for sure, but it is reliably estimated that at least 500,000 Iranians and Iraqis died in the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq War. At least another 1 million were wounded. And anyone who's ever seriously looked at it, killed in action to wounded in action, has to say that 1 million number doesn't add up. It should be much higher than that. The economic cost to the two belligerents is estimated at over $1 trillion. And these are two relatively poor and undeveloped countries. It also set in train and saw the largest use of chemical weapons in modern history. Nothing since World War I is like the use of chemical weapons employed primarily, not exclusively, but primarily, overwhelmingly, by the Iraqis against the Iranians. More than that, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s set in train what I have called a march of folly. It led to two more wars, more or less directly. The first Persian Gulf War. Iraq emerged from the Iran-Iraq War in 1989 with a 1 million-man army and a 1 million-man military industry in a country of 17 million people. And it was broke. It wasn't broke, it was in hock to other Arab countries to the tune of over $100 billion. With such a huge military and such a huge debt, Saddam Hussein did what he thought was the only smart thing to do. He tried to rob the bank next door called Kuwait and started the progress towards the so-called first Gulf War in 1991. And as we tragically know, the first Gulf War led a decade later to the second Gulf War, the Iraq War that President Obama campaigned against in 2008, and which he ended American involvement in 2011. The war also rallied the Iranian people behind the Islamic Revolution, dramatically and forcefully. Anyone who wasn't for the revolution anymore was a traitor to the Iranian people. And any opposition to the Islamic Republic was dealt with brutally and mercilessly, and were portrayed as the pawns of Saddam Hussein. The Iran-Iraq War is the key formative experience in the lives of today's Iranian national leadership. Supreme Leader Khamenei and Ahmadinejad look back over and over again to the Iran-Iraq War in their public speeches. They talk about it all the time, the so-called what they see as imposed war, imposed on Iran by the United States of America. It is the framework through which they view today's world, rightly or wrongly. And for many of their generation, especially Ahmadinejad's generation, it is constantly in the background of their minds because so many of their comrades, colleagues, and loved ones died or were grievously wounded. So what are the lessons that I think we can draw from looking back at the Iran-Iraq War in general, and in particular at the US involvement in the Iran-Iraq War, particularly the undeclared war at the end of the Iran-Iraq War? I think there are at least 4 key lessons that need to be kept in mind. There are others, but let me just highlight these 4. First, Iran is not a suicidal state. It does not seek to destroy itself. It is not seeking martyrdom as a country. It is an extreme, violent, and dangerous regime in many ways. But despite its frequent appellation, I would argue it's not crazy at all. It is not suicidal. It does not want to go out of business. Its overwhelming national security objective is the preservation of the Islamic Revolution. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the guardian of the state, has as its mission the guardianship of the revolution, the perpetuation of the revolution. Yes, Iran uses suicide bombers. It encourages martyrdom on an individual case. And in the Iran-Iraq War, it encouraged martyrdom military operations on large scales. Young boys and young men were sent into minefields knowing they were going to die. But there is a difference between using martyrs on the battlefield and being a suicidal state. And the difference is a suicidal state is prepared to see the entire state ruined. And there is nothing in the history of the Iran-Iraq War that suggests Iran is a suicidal state. Throughout the Iran-Iraq War, and particularly during the period of confrontation with the United States, Iran was very careful and modulated its level of escalation and its level of response to Iraqi and American escalation. It tried very hard to figure out what was far enough and what was too far, what might provoke a massive American military response versus a limited military response. It pushed the envelope, but it was always very careful not to push the envelope too far. In other words, it followed careful and deliberate escalation during the Iran-Iraq War. The years since 1989, I would argue, don't show any evidence that that fundamental fact has changed. And why is that important? Because if Iran is not a suicidal state, then an Iran with nuclear weapons is no more likely to behave like a suicidal state than any other state that has nuclear weapons. States with nuclear weapons can do really stupid things. Jim and Janet have written about the really most stupid thing anyone has ever done with nuclear weapons in 1962. But even in 1962, the law of deterrence in the end played a role. States do not want to commit suicide with nuclear weapons. They're willing to bully other countries. They may be risk-prone. They may be very adventuresome, particularly against non-nuclear countries, but they rule by the rules of nuclear deterrence. Secondly, I think if you look back at the whole period of the Iran-Iraq War, one lesson is overwhelmingly clear. The Islamic Republic of Iran is pretty hard to intimidate. These people are not easily scared. They're not easily pushed around. Military threats, military action, the threat of war and the use of war do not easily intimidate the Iranians. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran at a time when the Iranian military had basically collapsed in the wake of the revolution. It advanced quickly into Iranian territory. It had overwhelming superiority in the air, and it had the support of virtually the entire Arab world, except for Syria. And yet, the Iranians were not intimidated. They didn't give up. They didn't sue for peace in 1980. They ultimately let the American hostages go in order to improve their posture to deal with Iraq, another example of a country that may be unpleasant, but is still pragmatic and not suicidal. Their behavior throughout the war, and especially in the period with us, showed they were not easily intimidated or pushed around. Even after the United States Navy sank virtually the entire Iranian Navy in 1987 and 1988, Iran continued to fight back. Even after the Iraqis used massive quantities of chemical weapons on the battlefields and purged all Iraqi territory of Iranian forces, Iran refused to accept a ceasefire. Iraq sought a ceasefire from 1981 on. Iran finally agreed in 1988. The conventional wisdom in the United States has always been that it was the shooting down of an Iranian Airbus that convinced the Iranians to end the war. The research in Becoming Enemies concludes differently, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Iran continued to fight, and it continued to fight back asymmetrically and out of area. What do I mean by that? Iran used terrorism, including the use of a proxy terrorist organization, Hezbollah, created during the Iran-Iraq War, created in Lebanon in response to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, but created during the Iran-Iraq War. And Hezbollah was used as part of Iran's policy of striking back at the supporters of Iraq, in Lebanon, in Kuwait, and in other places. In short, Iran is a pretty difficult opponent to fight. Don't expect them to just roll over. And compare the situation today to the situation in the late 1980s. Iran, since the late 1980s, may not have developed a first-grade conventional military capability, but it has spent an awful lot of effort developing intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting Israel and American military bases throughout the Middle East. It has dozens, if not hundreds of them. So it has a capability it didn't have. Its ally Hezbollah, today, by most estimates, has 50,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon aimed at Israel. We've already seen that war once, in 2006. The northern quarter of Israel was essentially evacuated in response to that war. And Hezbollah has far more missiles than it has today. And if you ask me the question, how would Iran like to fight a war against Israel in the future? I'll give you the simple answer: to the last Lebanese. Question is, will Hezbollah do it? The odds are pretty good they will. And since the 1980s, Hezbollah and Iran have developed a global terrorist infrastructure. We know that. We know that Iranian diplomatic installations and Hezbollah has practiced terrorist operations and reconnoitered terrorist targets across the globe, including here in Canada. How do we know that? Because frequently the Iranians do it in a way in which we are intended to see that they do it, so that we understand they have that capability. I'll give you a dramatic exemption. Iranian embassy vehicles often park outside of American embassies. Iranian officials get out of the car with cameras and videos and take pictures and videotape the security guards. It's not exactly clandestine activity. It's intended to send a signal. Third lesson. Ending war with Iran is much harder than starting a war. Saddam Hussein started the war pretty quickly, I think in retrospect, far too quickly for his own good. It was an impulsive decision, and then he found that he couldn't get out of it. The war went on, as I said. Iraq basically wanted an end in 1981. It desperately wanted an end in 1982, but Iran wasn't prepared to end the war until 1988. What was it, in retrospect, looking at Iranian documents and Iranian memoirs, that persuaded the Iranians to end the war in 1988? It was not defeat on the conventional military battlefield. Overwhelming, if you look at Iranian accounts, it is their concern that the next ratchet up was going to be Iraqi surface-to-surface missiles equipped with chemical weapons landing in Iranian cities, especially Tehran. Missiles were already landing with conventional warheads in Iranian cities. And the Iranians were convinced that Iraq would use chemical weapons. The Iranians in these memoirs, in these accounts, and at the time, were talking about the next Hiroshima. That's what they saw on the horizon. That's what persuaded the Ayatollah Khomeini to, as he put it, drink the poison of ceasefire. Think about it for a minute. If that's what it took to end a war in 1988, what might it take the next time? Fourth lesson. America's allies in the Middle East, Arabs and Israelis, throughout the Iran-Iraq War, were consistently the source of bad, if not catastrophic, advice to the United States government. Both sides. Constantly giving America really, really, really bad advice about what to do. The Arabs. The Arabs were enthusiastic supporters of the war when it began because they thought it'd be quick and over quickly. When it didn't, they loaned Saddam more and more billions of dollars, and they pushed the United States and other countries around the world to support Saddam. We heard it from King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, from President Sadat of Egypt before his death, from President Mubarak of Egypt, from other Arab leaders in the Gulf, the UAE, Kuwait. We even heard it from Jordan's King Hussein, who became fast buddy of Saddam Hussein during the war. And their constant admonition was, support the Iraqis. Yeah, Saddam's a little rough around the edge, but he's a reformed man. He's okay now. He doesn't want to conquer the Middle East. He learned his lesson. You can work with him in the future. Right. So much for their advice. Israel, of course, during the Iran-Iraq War, supported who? The Iranians. Israel, throughout the Iran-Iraq War, was Iran's principal source of military equipment for its Air Force, for its American-equipped Air Force. The supplies for that Air Force came from Israel. It was known at the time, it's known today. Israeli leaders from Likud and Labor both agreed that restoring the alliance with Iran that they'd had during the time of the Shah was a preeminent Israeli national security goal, and that Iraq, not Iran, was the long-term threat to Israel. Not only did they provide arms, but the Iran-Contra episode shows they successfully persuaded President Reagan to do the same, under the ridiculous rubric of arms for hostages. It is hard to imagine a stupider episode in American diplomatic history than arms for hostages. One of the interesting vignettes in Becoming Enemies is so many State Department officers explaining how difficult it was for them to go and explain arms for hostages to other governments during the period, when of course they didn't believe in it at all. Israel's advice backed the Iranians. Pretty horrible advice too. Israel's advice, somehow we can persuade the Iranians through the provision of military equipment to be good guys again. One more footnote. The Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, the creator of the Islamic Republic, the man who originated the phrase that Israel should be wiped off the face of the earth, was the man who happily accepted Israeli arms during the Iran-Iraq War, reinforcing my first point. The Iranians may be unpleasant, this regime may be dangerous, but it's very pragmatic when it comes to issues of national survival. I think the lessons of the 1980s should sober anyone thinking about military action against Iran in the future. War with Iran is not likely to be simple, cheap, or quick. This vision of another Osirak reactor raid is a fantasy. This idea that Israel can go in like it did to Syria, take out a reactor, and no one even know about it is a mirage. It's not going to work that way. Two get to decide how long a war goes on, not one. Conflict between the United States and Iran would also be a regional war, from Beirut to the Khyber Pass. If the Iranians really want to stick it to the United States of America, the easiest place, next door, in Obama's war in Afghanistan, where Iran has been our de facto partner against the Taliban for more than a decade. Its decision to flip sides would make an already perilous mission in Afghanistan very, very difficult. It is no wonder, when you think about these things, that the former two heads of the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, Ephraim Halevi and Meir Dagan, have both come out publicly and unprecedented in Israeli history, saying military action against Iran should really be only done in the most extreme of cases. And the former head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal intelligence service, Yuval Dishkin, has said the same thing. Yuval has gone even further. Yuval has said that Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Barak are living in a messianic ideological world. They have lost contact with reality when they think about military action against Iran. I didn't say that. Yuval Dishkin said that. We should keep this in mind as well. So we should be thinking about alternatives. Let us hope that diplomacy works. Let us hope that sanctions have their impact. But let us be realistic. That may not work. Is really the only option then the use of military force? I would suggest to you we need a real debate on that in the United States and around the rest of the world. Obviously, an Iran with nuclear weapons is not the preferred outcome. We don't need any more countries with nuclear weapons. But is an Iran with nuclear weapons the apocalypse, the end of time, that demands military action? In my view, the option of containment and deterrence needs to be back on the table. It needs to be discussed seriously. It has pluses and minuses, like any option. In the real world of national security and foreign policy, there is never a simple, perfect solution. If there was, people would have adopted that. There are downsides to deterrence and containment of Iran. But that option, I think, needs to be put back on the table. Certainly in the United States. I think Israel, too, needs to have a serious conversation about this. Now, it's easy for people outside the Middle East to minimize Israel's serious concerns. It's a whole lot easier to talk about living with an Iran with nuclear weapons in Waterloo or Alexandria, Virginia, than it is in Tel Aviv. I understand that. But I think Israelis need a real discussion, and I applaud the former intelligence chiefs for making that discussion happen. I think they need to go a step further. And I think the whole world needs to go a step further in the conversation about the Iranian nuclear question. And that is to recognize a fact that we all know. Israel is not a defenseless little country. It is a very strong country. It has a powerful military. And it is a nuclear weapons state. It has been a nuclear weapons state since at least 1968, according to the foremost researcher and analyst of the Israeli nuclear program, an Israeli scholar named Avner Cohen. How many bombs Israel has, I don't know. Israel never discusses its nuclear program. It hides behind an argument that it will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East. That argument probably made sense in 1968. But does it still make sense in 2012? Moreover, Israel has a secure second strike capability. It has American F-15 and F-16 aircraft that can deliver nuclear weapons. It has Jericho intermediate-range ballistic missiles based on a French design. And it has submarines capable of launching nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. The German magazine Der Spiegel this summer revealed what had long been suspected, that the German government's provision of 4 submarines, U-boats, to Israel are in fact intended to deliver nuclear weapons. They can deliver conventional weapons as well, but they are intended to develop nuclear weapons. Israel's navy, in short, can devastate Iran from underneath the Arabian Sea, no matter what Iran has done to Israel. Of course, it's easier, as I said before, to be comfortable about living in this environment in Ontario and Virginia than it is in the Galil. But we need to debate this. We need to put this on the table. This is part of the decision. We should not be considering the use of military force without looking at all elements of the dynamic. We need a real debate, a debate that looks at all options, not just the option of the use of force. Coping with Iran is a difficult and dangerous problem. Iran is a dangerous adversary. Diplomacy's prospects for success, in my judgment, and I hope you'll ask me more about this in question and answer, are not particularly high. But in thinking about what to do about it, we need more than sound bites. American presidential elections specialize in sound bites, so I don't think that debate's going to start until November 7th, 2012, but I really hope it begins then. And I think that in the Becoming Enemies project, we have much to add to that debate and much to help us ponder how to proceed further. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Oh, my God. Okay. Thank you. My mic is live now. Great. Hello. Okay. We have a wonderful set of questions. Let me just give a couple of introductory points here. First, I just want to make a reminder that, in addition, and it was nice, thank you very much, Fred, for mentioning that Becoming Enemies is available out there. Along with it is Bruce's book as well, Deadly Embrace. Bruce knows more about Pakistan, which, if you sort of want another feel-good night, we'll bring him back and have him talk about Pakistan. Really give you some things to think about. Now, we worked hard. Bruce's book on Pakistan is available in English and Farsi. Alas, only the English version is outside, but it is there for purchase for you. Now, I do have, let me get to the one that I copied here. We have a bunch of questions, and Bruce, I'm going to actually ask you, because I just got them, and I'm in the process of sorting them through, and I will start with one of the most provocative ones. Young man, take your time in answering. Give me time to look at some of these questions, okay? So the first question is, do you think Israel would use nuclear weapons? Is Israel, well, it's a two-part question, actually, because I saw briefly here another one. So part one is, do you think Israel would use nuclear weapons? Part two, you commented that, in your view, Iran is not a suicidal state. What about Israel?
First, you sweet-tongued thing, young man. How kind.
Oh, let me just add part three as I'm going through here. You guys are wonderful.
I'm trying to get her to use softballs now, and instead she wants to make it harder and harder.
Part three is if you could comment just a little bit on your view of President Netanyahu. Just, you said some things, but someone would like that sort of fleshed out a little bit, again, in this mode of how is he on the sort of pragmatic to more reactive scale, let's say. Okay? And as I said, take your time.
You seem determined to get me in trouble right from the beginning. No, I don't think Israel is a suicidal state at all. I think Israel is a very rational acting state. It doesn't mean that all of its decisions are the right decisions. I put it to you in a slightly different way. Israel is a nuclear weapons state. It doesn't admit that. The US government doesn't admit that. The whole world kind of pretends that's not the case, but we all know it's true. Israel is the only nuclear weapons state in the greater Middle East, unless you count Pakistan, but I wouldn't count Pakistan in this environment. It therefore has a monopoly on nuclear weapons. And let's be honest, every country that has enemies, and almost every country that doesn't have enemies that has nuclear weapons, would like to have a monopoly. The United States would have loved to have kept its monopoly on nuclear weapons, and if we could have figured out a way to keep Stalin from getting them, we would have. Stalin didn't want communist China to get nuclear weapons, neither did his successors. And the Soviets seriously considered military force against the Chinese. So wanting to maintain a monopoly on nuclear weapons is not an insane policy. It's an understandable policy. And Israel, since 1968, has pursued a policy of maintaining its monopoly. Prime Minister Begin introduced what he called the Begin Doctrine in 1981 when he took out the Iraqi Osirak reactor. He never said that I'm taking out the Iraqi nuclear reactor in order to maintain a monopoly on Israel's nuclear weapons. Of course not. No one's going to say that. But that's what he did. Israel has used military force against Iraq in 1981, against Syria. It has used other mechanisms against other aspiring Arab nuclear weapons programs. Israel in the 1990s, for example, was, along with the United States, the biggest provider of intelligence to the United Nations Special Commission trying to disarm Iraq and to eliminate its weapons of mass destruction program. We all know now that that effort succeeded. There was nothing wrong with Israel doing that in the 1990s. The UN Security Council resolutions asked it to do so. Israel has, for I think understandable reasons, wanted to maintain a nuclear weapons monopoly in a region that is dangerous. Very, very dangerous. If you think about Prime Minister Netanyahu in that area, in that regard, he never says it, but I can tell you it's on his mind. He doesn't want to be the prime minister on whose watch historians write later Israel's monopoly on weapons of mass destruction in the region was lost by Bibi Netanyahu. I think that presses hard on his thinking and presses hard on the thinking of Prime Minister Barak. And here, because we can't talk about the Israeli nuclear program, we don't have a candid conversation about that. Would Israel use nuclear weapons? I don't think there's any likelihood of Israel using nuclear weapons out of the blue without some reason to. But we do have another historical example. I love using history, you can tell that. In the first Gulf War in 1991, Iraq threatened Israel with the use of chemical-tipped Scud surface-to-surface missiles. According to a very reliable account, on the eve of that war, in 1991, Ehud Barak, then Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, met with King Hussein of Jordan secretly in London. And according to the king's version of what happened, Ehud Barak passed the following message to the king to be passed to Saddam Hussein. If one chemical weapon is fired at an Israeli city, look at your watch. In 45 minutes, Baghdad will no longer exist. You want to know why Iraq didn't use chemical weapons in the first Gulf War? They took it seriously. They took it seriously. Would Israel use nuclear weapons in reaction to an Iranian nuclear strike? You bet they would. And they have a lot more than Iran has. Iran is at most, a nuclear weapon wannabe. It will not achieve an arsenal the size of Israel's under the most favorable circumstances for years and years. And that assumes that Israel would do nothing to its own arsenal. Now that's the worst outcome, an open-ended nuclear arms race between Israel and Iran. That is a terrifying option. But the question, would Israel use it? Yes. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think, is a figure who believes, I'll just quote what he says himself. He believes, and he has said it, that he is the Prime Minister of Israel in 2012 in the same position as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was in 1938, facing the rise of Nazi Germany. That's what he says. If that's what he believes, then he's kind of boxed himself into a corner. Because if you are an Israeli Prime Minister and you see the rise of Nazi Germany and it's 1938, you're kind of saying, if I don't do something, I will be responsible for horror ahead. Does he believe it? I don't know. I'm not a psychoanalyst. We'll see.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to again combine some questions, and these are combinations from here and that we've gotten from the web cast. They come from inside and outside Canada. So first, Bruce, can you talk a little bit about your view of why Iran might want nuclear weapons? Do they have reasons? Second, clearly you've made the argument that for lots of reasons. Non-proliferation in general is not a good idea. Non-proliferation in Iran in particular is not a good idea.
Proliferation is not a good idea.
Proliferation.
Right.
Thank you. Proliferation is certainly not a good idea. So the question is, if you think they are going in that direction, so there's a two-part question here. Does Israel have the military capacity to take on Iran alone in that sense, if in fact the US found some way to say no, however unlikely that might be? Secondly, do you think military action, although it's unwise, here the question is the fact that it's on the table, do you think the threat of military action has any potential to encourage the Iranians to back down, to stay under whatever red line Israel and the US give them?
Why would Iran want nuclear weapons? I've actually had this conversation with several American national security advisors. Look at the region. If you're sitting in Tehran, to the east of you is Pakistan, with the fastest growing nuclear weapons arsenal in the world. Just a little bit beyond that is India and China, both nuclear weapon states. Also, to the east of you is Afghanistan, a country which is in the hopefully terminal stage of a 35-year-old civil war with about 80,000 American combat troops on your border. Look to your north. Yes, you have the anemic states of Central Asia, but beyond them you have Russia, arguably the world's biggest nuclear weapon state in terms of size of arsenal. The history of Russian-Iranian relations is not a particularly nice one from the Iranian standpoint. Look to the west of you. You have Iraq, which was developing nuclear weapons and which fought an 8-year war with you, and which may, surprise, surprise, someday decide again it wants to get back in the nuclear weapons program. Further to the west, Israel, whose political leaders every day make statements saying they intend to maintain at least the option of military force. To the south of you, you have historic enemies, Saudi Arabia and others who, courtesy of WikiLeaks, we all know, have a pretty hard overview of what should be done with Iran. And of course, there's the United States, which has a fleet in the Persian Gulf equipped with nuclear weapons. My point is simple. Any Iranian national security advisor looking at that threat environment around him would say to his or her national command authority, boss, you know, it'd be a lot easier and our future would be a lot more secure if we had nuclear weapons too. Now, that's not nice, that's not a good thing. I would hope that that argument is not happening in Tehran, but I'll bet you it has been happening in Tehran for a long time. The environment they live in is one in which they perceive acute threat. Now, of course, they reinforce that by some of their policies. Supporting a terrorist organization is going to build you enemies. If you're paranoid and you act in paranoid ways, you're going to reinforce the animosity of your enemies. I'm not saying they are virgins, but I am saying that I think if for a minute you take yourself out of Waterloo and sit for a minute in the Supreme National Security Council staff in Iran, it's not hard to understand why you would think a nuclear deterrent is in your country's national interest. One more point. Iraq and Afghanistan have both been invaded or liberated, depending on your point of view, by the United States in the last 10 years. Neither one of them had nuclear weapons. We all know we would not have invaded Iraq or Afghanistan had either one of those countries had nuclear weapons. Look at North Korea. The entire world outside of the United States and perhaps Canada drew one lesson from Libya's decision to give up its nuclear weapons program in the early part of the 21st century. When you needed it, Mr. Gaddafi, it wasn't there anymore. Second question, Israel acting alone?
Hold on 1 second. Before you get to the second, I'm going to just use the moderator's prerogative one time. So Bruce, you've painted this position very reasonably of Iran living in a very tough neighborhood, extremely isolated. You've asked us appropriately to sort of put ourselves in the shoes of a security person in Tehran, and what would you recommend? All very reasonable. So, two-part quickie to follow up. Why is Iran so loathed by everyone, essentially? And secondly, if you're asking us to put our feet in Tehran and think about why it's reasonable, not good, but why it's reasonable for them to want the weapons, why is it so hard for the West and the other countries to do that? I mean, clearly nobody is making the argument, I understand you, Iran, and now let's try to work on those reasons that are making you want this. If you're asking us to do it, why aren't people asking national leaders to do it?
Well, I think the two questions are related.
Yeah.
Iran's isolation is, to a very large extent, a product of its behavior. When your idea of interaction with foreign diplomats is Iran's idea of interaction with foreign diplomats, that is, you hold them hostage and torture them for more than a year, you kind of lose your place in the international community. That's a reality. Now, the Iranians have a lot of arguments over why it happened, but they can't really change the facts. It is not just American diplomats who've seen that, it's other countries' diplomats which have seen that, including the British, and I think your government is concerned it can happen to Canadian diplomats in the future. It's more than that, of course. It is more than simply that. But I think it's hard to just say the Iran hostage crisis is history, let's forget it, since the regime is the same regime that did it. It's more than that, though. Iran's a Shia country in an overwhelmingly Sunni world. Sunnis and Shias, as we have all discovered to our horror over the last decade, have a thing that is hard for us non-Muslims to understand, but which is extreme. It's Persian. Most of its neighbors are Arabs, or at least non-Persian. It is a country that, for no fault of its own, has historically been isolated in many ways from others. Why can't we why can't we empathize more? Why can't we understand more? I think we need to, clearly. I think we need to. I think that is the path to creative diplomacy, is to figure out how can we address Iran's concerns, whether we think they're legitimate or not. If we want diplomacy to succeed, we have to think of ways to address their concerns. Why we haven't done so? Well, I can't speak for the rest of the world, but as I said at the beginning, Iran is a hot button in American politics. It has become a hot button. It has been a hot button since 1979. An awful lot of Americans don't think terribly rationally about Iran. Mirror image, I suspect there are a lot of Iranians who don't think very rationally about the United States, and the absence of dialogue, which has now gone on for 33 years, only reinforces that. There is no cadre in the United States government of people who have spent their career in Iran reporting back to Washington on Iranian views. And when you don't do that, the country after a while becomes a demonized stick figure. Let me go back quickly to the two other questions you raised. Israel alone. Israel is a very competent military power. Do not underestimate the Israelis. The United States has helped Israel develop very significant military capabilities. And again, truth in advertising, I did that myself with enthusiasm. At the Pentagon, CIA, and other places, our marching orders from every president was to enhance Israel's strategic advantage. And I think we've done a very good job. And I, for one, am proud of it. Israel is not a weak and defenseless state. And I think that's an important standing point for understanding the reality of where we are today, not the code words and the slogans, but the reality. Can Israel do what the United States military can do? No. Nobody can. But it probably could set back Iran's program for a number of years. And then what? What do we do the day after? Does anyone seriously think that anyone in Russia or China is going to respect Resolution 1929 after Israel attacks Iran? Forget it. The Russians and Chinese will be like vultures descending on the arms market in Iran as quickly as they can. And if it's in violation of 1929, they'll say, well, 1929 is irrelevant anymore. And so will the rest of the international effort. A United States military operation is different. Not for any good reason other than the United States is a superpower and people are less likely to cross the United States. Israel's not a superpower, and you will see a lot of support for the current comprehensive arms embargo on Iran collapse in the wake of an Israeli strike. The threat question. Of course, the threat is useful. Of course, the notion that there could be a penalty is useful. But you have to be really, really careful with that kind of thing. Threats can become self-fulfilling prophecies. They should be made carefully. I think the old admonition, speak softly and carry a big stick, applies very well to the question of using threats. The more you do it, the more you're backing yourself into a corner.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to bring in the issue of Syria a little bit. And we have a question here that says, so the U.S. Certainly is supporting in a number of ways the Syrian opposition, not certainly all that explicitly in terms of military support yet, but our person in the audience would like to know, if the U.S. continues to support the Syrian opposition and maybe escalates to some military support, would you see that, or would the U.S. Policymakers see that as part of an undeclared war, essentially, against Iran as well?
I'm going to make a broader statement and then come down to that.
Yeah.
We are in an undeclared war. I said it before, we're fighting a cyber war with Iran. That's a whole new departure in military activity. But it's a war. Nobody doesn't call it a war. We're doing other things. And the Israelis are doing a lot of things. Meir Dagan, who has so strongly criticized Bibi, spent a decade figuring out ways to make Iran's nuclear program difficult and to working in the Iranian nuclear program extremely hazardous to your life. I don't think the Iranians see a whole lot of distinction between the American cyber war, which is done cooperatively with Israel, and the Israeli assassination campaign, which Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said, and I believe her, we are not involved in. I think that distinction is probably lost in Tehran. And they're fighting back too. Iran is fighting back. It's fighting its war too. It's using asymmetric measures. I love the term asymmetric. Asymmetric is a fancy way of saying terrorism, but it just sounds so much nicer than saying terrorism. They're fighting back in an asymmetric way. Somebody is killing Israeli tourists. They're not just having a bad day in Bulgaria. Somebody targeted the Israeli defense attaché in New Delhi, India, earlier this year. And in many ways, that covert war, that spy versus spy war, has been going on since 1980. Believe me. fought in that spy versus spy war. It's been going on for a long time. But there's a difference between covert, below a certain level activity and overt military activity. And the war in Syria has a lot of dimensions. The civil war in Syria has a lot of dimensions. Most of them are domestic, local Syrian, but there has now become a regional war in Syria as well. And the Iranians are supporting the Bashar Assad's government. Of course they are. The Assads have been Iran's only consistent source of support in the Arab world since the Iranian Revolution. For a wide variety of reasons, and I don't think it's the commonality of Shiism with the Alawite faith. I think it's more about strategic reasons. But they are their most consistent ally, and they know their ally is at risk today in a way the Assads have never been at risk before, and they're supporting him. The opposition is getting support from Iran's enemies in the region, including the Saudis, the UAE, the Qataris. They are far out in front of us. They make no secret that they're doing it. It's a proxy war. The war in Syria is a proxy war now. Some would argue, like the former head of the Mossad once removed, Ephraim Halevi, that this is the really decisive conflict. That if Israel really wants to stick it to Iran, help the Syrian regime be overthrown, and then you will have significantly weakened Iran's strategic position in the region, and you will have put Hezbollah in a very, very difficult position in Lebanon, and you can ultimately destroy Hezbollah if you have a Syrian government that is anti-Hezbollah. It's an interesting argument. My point is, there is a proxy war going on that will probably escalate, unfortunately, for the Syrian people. I'm not here to talk about what the U.S. should do in Syria. I don't think we have very many good options. I don't think any of the West have good options. And I think that the very tragic events in Benghazi the other day should be a sobering reminder that revolutions are not tea parties.
You mean tea parties not in the U.S. political sense?
Right, right.
We have to be careful of our vocabulary.
Exactly, exactly. Good point. They're not the kind of tea parties you go to with fancy cups. They are, by definition, violent things, and one should be very careful about how you intervene in them.
So, a question back on Iran and their, let's assume, nuclear aspirations. Okay, so the question here is, suppose that the Iranian nuclear program is stopped or degraded in some way, whether it's an attack, a cyber, whatever. The question is, does Iran have an option of buying nukes on the black market?
Possibly. And the most likely place would be North Korea.
Yeah.
North Korea is a very dangerous state. It has nuclear weapons. How good those nuclear weapons are is a matter of a lot of intense debate within the intelligence community, but it has them. And it has nothing else to sell.
God knows.
It's conceivable. The Iranians could look there. I think it is a conceivable, more likely in the wake of military activity than it is today, simply because in the wake of military activity, I think whatever hesitation there is in Tehran today about going for a nuclear weapons program will be ended the minute there is a military confrontation with either Israel, the United States, or both. This is a useful point to bring up the very controversial U.S. national intelligence estimates. The U.S. national CIA put out an estimate in 2007, very famously, that said Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Now, read carefully in the estimate, and there is a public version of it. It didn't say they weren't developing a capability. It was saying they weren't actually developing the weapon. And it's an important distinction, although in some ways it's not a dispositive distinction. Because once you have the capability to build a bomb, the actual construction of the bomb is the simplest part of it. But the US intelligence community also in that estimate said that it was their judgment that Iran had been pursuing a nuclear weapons program up until about 2003 or 2004, and then halted that part of its nuclear capability program. It continued to enrich uranium, but it ceased work on the weapon itself. And the judgment was also expressed that it did so because in the wake of the American invasion of Iraq in particular, Iran was fearful of an American military action against it. Now, this estimate has been hotly debated, and neither you nor I today have access to the classified data that underlies it, so we can debate it all we want, but we really don't know how good it is. My point is this: the US intelligence community made the argument there in effect that this is a pragmatic decision-making process. And I think that's a very important argument, a terribly important argument. It is not a crazy. It may not be easy for us to understand, but it is pragmatic from Iran's own perspective. And here you have the US intelligence community saying that.
Bruce, you are brilliant in so many ways, actually. By ending your answer with that, you gave just a perfect segue to my next question. I'm in awe. What can I say?
We're in a Vulcan mind melt or something.
What can I say? Impressive. All right, so I'm pulling together a few questions from here and from the web that have come in. Okay, so you're talking about the intelligence service saying, you know, this is a pragmatic regime and, you know, not crazies and so forth. And you've made the point yourself, and you talked about, you used a phrase about sort of the reliance on the deterrent quality of nuclear weapons. On the one hand, okay, but on the other hand, you've also made so many points about how horrible and stupid and counterproductive even an attack on Iran would be. Now, a couple people in our audience are sort of putting 1 and 2 together and getting 4 because they're suggesting if you have all these horrible reasons, well, where did the non-crazy deterrent argument go? Because then you'd think that everybody would say, well, no military risk, done with that. But of course they haven't. So how do you put the non-crazy deterrent with the crazy military risk mindsets together?
Well, this is why there is a debate. And frankly, I think there's a healthier debate in Israel
Really?
in many ways than there is in the United States. I think that's starting to change. Just in the last 24 hours, a new study has come out, co-chaired by former National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I think everyone would acknowledge are not exactly neophytes in this business. And their argument, I haven't had a chance to read the report in its totality, but what I understand of it is that we really need to think about this option of containment and not just throw it off the table. We need a thorough debate of this whole issue, and I think that's healthy. I go back in the Israeli case, and I think one needs to try here to put yourself in the Israeli Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv, where you know the truth. You've had a monopoly on nuclear weapons since the late 1960s. And that has allowed you to conduct certain levels of military activity, which if you didn't have that monopoly, you would feel less comfortable doing. It would be constraining. I don't think it's really hard to get into that and understand that. I think that is entirely understandable. And the idea that that era may be coming to an end is not your favorite next phase in Israeli history. There are dangerous things that could happen that have never happened before. And you would be very reluctant to see that era happening. So I don't find it at all crazy that Israelis would be debating this. But I think what is reassuring about the Israeli debate is that you have people who are saying, okay, yes, but the day after. And that's really what Meir Dagan and Ephraim Halevi spoke about the most. What happens the day after, when we have successfully attacked? How do we deal with the consequences of that action? I think the debate, and I don't want to be a broken record, has been less thorough and less complete in the United States, and it hasn't been a very serious debate in the political arena, and that's not a big surprise. Politics is not usually the place where thoughtful commentary is thrown around, and I'm sorry to say that's certainly the case in the United States. If you didn't watch the Republican presidential debates, you really missed an opportunity to see how this issue plays in the United States, where I think essentially, with the exception of Ron Paul, every Republican candidate tried to outdo the other Republican candidates in being harder on Iran. There wasn't any thoughtful conversation there. Ron Paul occasionally, a few times, said, you know, does this really make sense? And the body language of the other 8 candidates looking at him like, well, who are you? Are you from the planet Mars? And I think they understood American politics much better than Ron Paul did.
Yeah, absolutely. Question here about if you get to your point that you made about taking another look at containment. How does Iran's active, we'll call it asymmetric warfare, play into the difficulties that bringing containment back into play might have?
Containment is never an easy strategy to pursue. Among other things, it's frustrating because it's open-ended. Containing the Soviet Union in the Cold War was very frustrating. It was never popular policy. It was, in the end, the rational policy, but it was never terribly popular. Political candidates often ran against containment, and then when they got into office, supported containment, only they usually found a way to hide that. I would argue that we have been pursuing containment of Iran since 1979. That has been the American approach. We never seriously attempted regime change in Iran, largely because that was never a viable option. There was no internal force that we could support to overthrow the Iranian regime. So as much as some of my colleagues in the covert action program in the CIA would have loved to have pursued a regime change option, it wasn't there. And they were honest enough to report that to presidents starting with Carter and including Reagan and others. So we've essentially pursued containment. How well have we done? I'd argue we've done pretty well. Not great, but pretty well. Iran has succeeded in exporting its revolution to Lebanon. The Lebanese War of 1982 helped an awful lot in making that happen. The mistakes of Operation Peace for Galilee, most Israelis would be the first to tell you, helped to create the Hezbollah. So they've exported the revolution to to Lebanon. Lebanon's a beautiful little country, but it's not exactly a strategic powerhouse. So give them that gain. What else? What other place have they exported their revolution to successfully? really nowhere. What is their next most friendly country? Syria. And Syria is, the shelf life of the Assad government is, I hope, running out. The only other government in the region which is increasingly sympathetic to Iran is, of course, Iraq. And it isn't because of Iran's policies. One can make the argument, I'm being facetious here, that George Bush was a closet Shia, because he certainly seems to have done an awful lot for Shia political power in the Middle East. I don't think he intended to do that. My point is, in general, yes, Iran has been a very difficult country to deal with, but on the whole, our containment has been fairly successful. A lot of that has to do with those attributes of Iranian behavior I described earlier. It's a Shia country in a Sunni world. It's a Persian country in an Arab world. It self-contains to a certain extent. But we've also been, I think, reasonably successful in doing so. So I think that would argue that containment in a nuclear environment, which is not the optimal outcome by any means, don't get me wrong, that is not the optimal outcome, but it is a doable outcome. It is a policy that we can make work.
So just a quickie on that. Given that you mentioned that containment has officially been taken off the table, do you think there's a politically viable way to essentially operationalize a containment policy but not talk about it? I mean, or how do you get something that's off a table functionally onto a table?
That's what we call the miracle of democratic politics. The day after the election, all kinds of things become possible that aren't so easy to envision before the election. Don't get me wrong here. I have no reason to believe that either Governor Romney nor President Obama will have a conversion to containment after the election. I think they should, but I'm not predicting that they will. But I sure hope we will have a serious debate about that.
Okay, I'm going to just run it down with two relatively direct and shortest questions. So could you comment on, from your role as an advisor to presidents over the course of the existence of the Islamic Republic of Iran, what role do you think it plays that the country is seen as being ruled by Muslim clerics? Is that sort of, well, what do you think?
35% of Republican voters in Ohio, when asked recently, according to a poll, believe that President Barack Obama is a Muslim.
God.
The man who brought justice to Osama bin Laden's national origins are still in debate in the United States. And it's not an accident that they're in debate, because his middle name is Hussein. There is a huge Islamophobia that remains in the United States. And, I'll speak for the United States. In the 2008 election, this was used in some campaigns against the president, that he really wasn't one of us, because his middle name is Hussein and he's probably a Muslim. And I think former Secretary of State Colin Powell said it best. What if he was? What's wrong with that? I was serving in the second Bush administration on the morning of September 11th. It's not remembered well, but it should be remembered that 6 days after 9/11, President Bush 43 went to a mosque in Washington, and he said, Islam is a religion of peace. It is not a religion of terror. These are extremists. They're not Islamic. They're not Muslims. They are evildoers. You remember, President Bush liked the term evildoers. In this case, he had it right, I think. President Bush, in my view, finest moment was that day, when he made the decision that this would not be a war against Islam, but a war against terrorism. One can argue he should have been more explicit who the terrorists were, but he got the big thing right. I'm not George Bush's biggest fan, but I think he deserves an awful lot of credit for that. And I think as Americans, we ought to remember what George Bush did 6 days after 9/11 and keep that as the lodestone of how we deal with this issue. Yes, Islam is not well understood. Shia Islam is particularly not well understood. And there are a lot of aspects of Shia Islam that are pretty hard for Anglicans like myself to naturally comprehend. But it's worth the effort. We're going to have to live with Iran, one way or another. And they're not going to cease being Muslims, and they're not going to cease being Shias. So we're going to need to get over that. And we need in general to get over this whole question of Islamophobia in the United States. Those who make movies that demonize the Prophet Muhammad are the allies of Al-Qaeda. I'll put it as simply as that.
Okay, last question. Person in the audience picked up on the interesting point that you made, that during the Iran-Iraq war, that Israel was a great supporter of Iran. And the person confessed, probably speaking for many of us, that they didn't know that really at the time, didn't appreciate it. And obviously now, Israel is not a proponent of Iran. So could you talk just a little bit about sort of where that flip-flop occurred and what spurred it?
Well, Israel and Iran under the Shah were very close partners. The Shah was looking for allies against the Arab world, and there was Israel. Israel was looking for allies against the Arab world, and there was the Shah of Iran. Up until the Iranian Revolution, almost every Israeli cabinet member secretly made a trip to Tehran during the course of their time in the Israeli cabinet and came home with a great Persian carpet. It was an open secret in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Where did all these Persian carpets come from? The Shah of Iran gave them to me. I got it on my trip. It was a great strategic advantage for Israel to have an alliance with Iran. For one thing, it meant that Iraq couldn't send a significant army to fight Israel because it had to worry that if it did that, the Shah of Iran would take advantage of it. Israelis were very reluctant to see that alliance end when it did in 1989, and they hoped that pragmatism in Iran would win out over ideology. And they stuck to that proposition for a long time, and they saw the Iran-Iraq war as the mechanism to reinforce the pragmatic element. And when Iran said, yeah, sure, we'll take your guns, happy to take your spare parts, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then they sold it to the Reagan administration. Now, to be fair to the Israelis, they didn't sell it in the crude terms of arms for hostages. They sold it as a strategic option to reach out to, quote, moderates in Iran, and by providing limited military equipment, you could strengthen them and moderate Iranian behavior. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense today, and a lot of people didn't think it made a whole lot of sense in the 1980s, but it was the position of successive Israeli governments. The real turn didn't happen until after the first Persian Gulf War. Once the Israelis realized that the Iraqi threat was no longer there, courtesy of George Bush 41, then they began dealing with what they realized was that Iran was not going to go back to being its partner in the future, and that in fact it was an adversary, and it is an adversary. And a lot of that adversarial relationship has grown out of the proxy war between Iran and Israel in Lebanon, which has become more and more violent and deadly over the years, and has now created the situation, the all too real situation, for Israeli military planners that if they do seriously contemplate an attack on Iran, they also need to seriously consider whether they're going to preempt Hezbollah, meaning that a prudent Israeli military planner would not only plan to attack Iran, but simultaneously to preempt Hezbollah's threat on the northern border, because you don't want to wait until Hezbollah fires those 50,000 missiles. You want to preempt it. It's a tough environment. I should be very clear here. I've spent a great deal of my career working with the Israelis. I know Meir Dagan, I know Ephraim Halevi, I know Yuval Dishkin, I know Bibi Netanyahu. We're not exactly best friends. I understand the difficulties they face. I understand Israel's sense of danger. They live in a dangerous part of the world. This isn't North Dakota and Saskatchewan. They face very difficult decisions. They haven't always gotten them right. They've gotten a lot of them right. I'm sympathetic to them. But I think the Israeli people and the American people and the rest of the world need a candid and honest conversation about Iran's nuclear threat. It is not the apocalypse. It is not the end of time. There are other ways of dealing with it short of starting another war in the Middle East. We've lived now, in the last decade in the United States, through 2 wars in the Middle East. If that hasn't sobered us up, I don't know what is going to.
Well, while Fred is making his way up, let's do the first round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Esteemed panel for drawing light onto the issues facing the American voters and really the whole world regarding Iran today as the U.S. election unfolds. We can assume that the outcome, either re-electing the current president or a new president, will have global ramifications. So we heard tonight that a war against Iran could be longer, wider, and more dangerous than widely imagined, that containment of a nuclear Iran should be an option on the table, and that we need a real debate on these issues before the U.S. election, not just sound bites, all excellent insights. And so on behalf of CIGI and everyone here, I'd like to, well, first of all, again, thank Jim and Janet for luring Bruce here, and then especially to Bruce for his remarks tonight. Thank you again. If you enjoyed tonight's discussion, I'm reminded that you can pick up the book Becoming Enemies just outside the door here. A few notes for audience just before you leave. The next CIGI public event will take place this Saturday during the daytime. The CIGI campus is part of Doors Open Waterloo region, and so you're invited to explore the whole building, the Balsley School, and there'll be people here with all sorts of interesting things to share. On September 20th, the Forerunner Film and Speaker Series will be presenting the film Behind Closed Doors, the Human Rights Crisis in North Korea. and Canada Research Chair in International Human Rights, Rhoda Howard-Hassman, and Kyung Lee of the Council for Human Rights in North Korea will be on hand to have a discussion. And then stay tuned to the CIGI website. We have an excellent season coming up. We have an ambassador series to launch in late October. Jim and Janet will be back with some events to mark the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis and much more in the coming years. So stay tuned to our website, register for our events newsletter, and thank you again for coming. Please have a safe journey home.